Welcome to my typical return to Gran Turismo 7 Online. This video is showing stuff from the PlayStation free online weekend that started 2 hours late because of course it did. But nonetheless, that's not the main issue. The real and true issue is that I never have done videos in past saying typical GT7 online or typical race or whatever it may be, and it's utter chaos. Like I said, it's the norm now that Gran Turismo 7 is the fake wrestling of simulation racing esports. At its best, it's a fun parody. At its mostly, it's a disgrace to the actual competition. And I'll be honest, I'm purposely releasing this video after the update and after the official Gran Turismo events and all that, because, like I said, at its most, it's a disgrace, but there are some occasional good things. And actually, I'll touch on that a little bit here, because overall, that is typical. In a sea of mediocrity to downright terribleness, there is occasional good things, but overall, I mean, this is the main awful, awful thing that in the past I would have never played online again as long as this game was the main one. I actually will link it in the description because this video where I kind of have a lot of references to things in the past. But the main one is that the very last clip that I made of GT Sport until it started ending, and like I said at the time, the only reason I went back to play GT Sport is because GT7 was so underwhelming. If GT7 was even a decent game, I would have never even went back to GT Sport towards the end of it. But yeah, the very last clip of GT Sport, which was like 2021 or something that didn't come back until almost 2024, is pretty much what this is. So let's get into it, folks. This is the beginning and most heinous. In a way, it's not technically typical, but in a general sense, it is. I get into it as it goes. So to start off, it's actually looking pretty cotton picking good, ain't it? It's going down to the last lap of the race. This is the weekly race B with the Group 4 at Brain Touch Indy, where it's the required pit stop, and it's looking like if it's coming down the last lap, it's going to end up being a extremely tight race, ain't it? The ghosting system is working. Hallelujah. And it's going to be a really good race. But, I mean, y'all can take context clues and all that. I'm starting out with this clip, so guess right now what goes wrong. As I said, the ghosting system is working, and it's looking like it's going to be a really close race. And this is a quite fast field, too. My best lap is a 47.2. You can take my driving as you may on how quality of a field it is. But, yeah, let's get into it. And it's actually a Lamborghini. It's not even the meta car. So there's that, too. Again, occasionally, there's positives worth mentioning. While the G70 was the best car, there were some cars that could compete pretty well with it. And this Lamborghini was actually one of them. And there you go. It's actually able to overtake me out of the pits. So that's something. It did use the ghosting system to its advantage. I will say that. You can take that as you may of if someone that is ghosted should pass through the non-ghosted car. But it's the very last lap of the race, so I'm not really going to fault that driver for that. Especially because, and I didn't realize it was going to happen, look what that driver does. I was looking back at the time, like this is my actual footage and not a replay. I looked back because I heard wrecking and the lap car wreck. So I looked back for a very brief moment, so my reflexes weren't really good enough for this. That car, from what I could tell at the moment, because again, my reflexes were to Danny, so my mind wasn't, they never ordered Danny, so my mind wasn't really working perfect. I thought at this time that this car in the lead was actually sweeping to the other side and slowing down because some people go with that ghosting thing. They don't want to pass, especially if it is on the very last lap through the non-ghosted car, because that's not realistic. So I genuinely thought that's what this driver was doing was pulling off to the side and slowing down to let me by, but it didn't work. There was some contact that ain't the dandiest, but I'm way ahead of third, so I mean, if that driver's actually intending to do that, slow down a bit more, and it's no big deal. Yeah, that's not the dandiest. Also, that at speed, and y'all can make your own judgments. It's borderline looking on purpose. Even by this point, I was thinking, oh, this might be on purpose, but it's an incredibly stupid strategy. Because I got the pole and the fastest lap and all that. So it'd probably just be to catch up and wreck him at this point. Especially because coming out of the pits, the tires ain't as warmed up. So, yeah, you probably don't want to piss off the faster driver. But going way wide like this, I was thinking either A, it was going to be easy pass anyway, or B, that driver just surely did mess up and was still at least trying to let me around. There's just bad circumstances there, but still, again, way ahead of third, so not the end of the world. Looking back to make sure, even the lap car didn't catch up. But this is obviously blatant. Like, I clearly had all the rest of the track there that I was turning towards anyway to get the better angle into the next turn anyway. That's, like, look at how the dot. I'm clearly all the way turning to the right. I feel like this driver should notice that. So if they were really letting me by, they're on the left, I'm clearly turning all the way to the right. Should be easy enough. If that driver really and truly wanted to let me around, could have just stayed all the way on the left there. Instead, sweeps directly in front of my car, and at this point, it's obvious. It's not what that driver did. Again, by maybe this point, that's kind of what I was thinking, but again, it's just a stupid strategy. I didn't really realize it was going to work. But no, because the Gran Turismo 7 ping physics, which I've talked about before, it doesn't just work. It catapults me into the grass somehow. How in the blue blazes do I go into the grass here? I'm on the other side of the track, not really with all that much speed, because I'm just exiting that turn. And somehow those ping physics launch me all the way into the grass. Now granted, you may be thinking, in a just world, the driver in front at this point would probably at least get a 5-second penalty. It's Gran Turismo 7 we're talking about, so you know how this goes. Gran Turismo 7 is the least just, quote-unquote, real racing simulator out there. It's the WWE, folks, it really is. This is perfectly fine. That driver got player, I'm not saying driver anymore. Driver's been far too nice. That player did not get a penalty for that. Again, link in the description. When this happened in GT Sport, granted it was, when it happened in Sport, the very first hit was obvious that it was going on. Like if I realized at, I'm gonna wait for it, folks. If I realized at the point in which the first contact is made that this driver was purposely being dirty, then I could have avoided it. Maybe I wasn't going to avoid that. Maybe. But I also didn't know what the ghosting system was going to do either at that point. So in hindsight, there's really no way I was going to know that driver's been dirty there. Because this is the first time I've actually encountered that driver this race. Because I pitted earlier. The reason that I pitted earlier this race is because another reference. As I said, I'm referencing stuff in the past. Remember way back when in GT Sport, when I did the initial boycott, it was the Gran Turismo Sport Update 1.13 and 1.14. All in all, those were still the worst updates for online racing in the history of Gran Turismo, any game. This ain't really all that far from it. But those were still the worst, so I did the boycott. And part of what I mentioned in that boycott, far from the main reason, but part of it is that at the time, they were actually starting me, or anyone that qualified on pole, for the particular weekly race A, which was Volkswagen Beetles, a really old one, at Tokyo Expressway Center Outer Loop. All the time started the pole sitter in first gear and second place in second gear. That was a massive issue, and I talked about it in the boycott. And actually, there were other times in which that happened too, but that was when it was at its worst because that car was such slow shifting and moving in general. Obviously, not as big of a deal in this race, but it's still, even that was back in like 2018, even in 2024, that's still happening. The pole sitter for this race, at least in a G70, like I was, always, I used a G70 for every race I was in, starts in first gear. From what I've noticed, any car starting in second would start in second gear. And the Lamborghini Huracan, which is this player that started in second, just so happened of the acceleration between of the speed in which you start down to the first turn was fast enough with me being in first gear and them being in second gear, so thus the time it took to shift up unnecessarily was enough for the Huracan to get alongside, and it was not the most dirty thing in the world. I didn't even actually save that individual clip. I did save the race afterwards, so I could go back and look, but honestly at that point it wasn't terribly dirty. It was a small nudge going into the very first turn on cold tires when that car had a whole heck of a heap of momentum. So, I mean, I really didn't judge that too much, but nonetheless it was enough to where the Lamborghini got away. So on like lap 5, after I stayed between about a second and half a second behind the Lamborghini to kind of go out to test out how they're driving and all that, making any mistakes. That car didn't make any mistakes, so I just went ahead and pit on lap 5 because I saw there was a gap so I could work with pitting, and there were no other cars that really factored into the race. At that point, then we kind of just ran our own race, and we came out on this lap equal. So there's even more synopsis for that, and yeah, so even in this one race, it harkens back to two bad things. One is bad, the starting in different gears. Granted, who knows, if I were to use other cars, maybe they would start in second gear, I don't know. I only use the G70, and not to brag, but every race I did, I qualified on pole, so I didn't look on what other people had with that, but yeah. As I said, this I kind of understand why it wasn't a penalty, because I think if that driver were intending it and messed up to just let me by, that's not the end of the world. Even a little bit here, because cars are loose after the initial contact, and probably should have just went ghost anyway, if the ghosting system were to actually work. So, no penalty at this point is not the end of the world. It probably would have been all in all better if that driver had a penalty. I mean, especially if the game could actually even do math and tell how far the third place was back and gave that car like a 2-second penalty or something, because it wouldn't have affected the race anyway. It would have been the same 1-2 finish. But at this point, it should have been like at least a 5-second penalty, probably 10. Especially because in quite a few instances of the Gran Turismo penalty system, if contact leads to the other car going in the grass, it actually gives the car that initialized it, whether on purpose or not, or if even the front car brake checks, like is what exactly happened here, no matter whose fault it is, if the other car goes into the grass, almost always the one that didn't go into the grass gets a penalty, whether deserved or not. This one, it's obviously deserved. Like, whether it's brake checking or ramming or into the side or whatever it may be, deserved or not, almost always, at least from how I remember it, again, this was my return to Gran Turismo 7 Online. the last race that I did was in February, which was the car it's actually here at Brands Hatch Indy, and that one was unremarkable. There wasn't even really enough clips for that. And again, that's not to my own decision. I did long videos about that. You can look that up if you want, but I mean, at this point, it's not worth paying for PlayStation Plus anyway, when the main game that I played is GT7, and GT7 started out quite typical. Now, you may be saying this is an isolated incident, so you can't really say how typical something is in an isolated incident. Well, folks, as I said, in the boycott over a year ago at this point, that of any instance in which I witnessed dirty driving, whether it's me being involved with it or someone else in the race that I notice it, if it's in a race that I'm in and I notice that happens, I will mention it. If y'all want, I can actually go over it individual instances, but there's a whole heck of a heap of individual instances, some longer than others. Yeah, that's 3, 6, 9, 12, and including that one is 13 different instances. If I were to do my usual, I mean, some videos I'd even spend like 15 minutes talking about an individual instance, and this is no exception. Actually, I didn't realize it was this long of me talking about that individual instance. So that is actually my typical, I guess, ain't it? Just talking about 15 minutes per individual instance. I would say is about my average. So there's 12 others. You can do the math there. That's far more than I really want to talk about. So instead, what I'm going to do, if I can find it. Give me a minute, folks. Hopefully I can find it. Maybe. I'm going to show something in the background. There we go. This is, hopefully this doesn't take up the entire time and I have to show something else. This is 58 straight minutes of me just doing qualifying for the race. And frankly, this, on average, was a more fun experience than I had at the best doing this race. Probably the most fun that I had with this race is in another clip, which might just end up being a clip, like later on or whatever. It's not really worth showing because it's straightforward. I can explain it and y'all can definitely visualize it anyway. Is that for another race, I actually kind of did of what I mentioned the previous race. It stayed around half a second to 1 second back of the first place driver, but instead it was a slightly different circumstance this time around. This was a race later on when the initial second place in qualifying also had a G70 and qualified not even a tenth behind my time, and frankly just passed me on like race pace. Maybe an individual lap. I think I actually ended up getting the fastest individual lap for that race, but just of overall race pace, the second place driver is faster. As I said, like time and again, of the way that I would do qualifying is I would do qualifying to pretty much the absolute best I could possibly get, and I'm not realistically going to be racing at that pace. That's how it usually works for my best qualifying times. I've said it even well before I talked about cerebral palsy and stuff like that. Take my driving as you may, as I said even again well before that. And so it's, I mean, same thing there. A different race I got passed fairly and all that. So, what I was trying to do for the last lap, because frankly I wanted it to be as close as possible with no contact, is going out of the pits. We both pitted going in to the last lap. I was pretty much right on first back bumper, and again, it might end up getting a clip later on. But again, you can visualize. We're coming out of the pits. The car that initially qualified second is in first by about 1 car length. And what I was going to try and do, because first, rightfully so, going into the last lap, was very much on the bottom into turn 1. So there was no way I was taking that whatsoever. So what I was trying to do is to bank my car to get a little bit of momentum. With GT7, there's the attempt to sort of kind of be realistic in the real driving simulator, and they have the don't cross the pit line thing. But frankly, I figured the pit line would be like it is with the white line around this track, is where, I mean, as you can see, even just in these qualifying laps and such, you can easily have 2 tires well beyond the white line, as long as you're not all the way really into the dirt of this track, where there's kind of that sand of turn 1, or the grass later on, or a little bit the dirt bits and stuff like that. You can go well beyond the white. So what I did is I pretty much went about halfway through the white line to actually make sure that there would be no way I got a penalty. And they treat that white line completely different than they do of any other white line on the track. Like, I did it relatively conservatively, because I was making sure I didn't get a penalty, so then that way I would get a run in it, because rightfully so, the leader was taking the defensive line. That's not dirty or anything like that. And, again, y'all can context, I got a penalty for the pit line crossing. I never actually crossed it. I was just on the line with 2 tires around about half my car. I wasn't even remotely close to fully crossing it. Like, look, right there. Right there. I went back a little bit too much. I mean, really, this is as good of examples. In the next turn, I used a little bit more track, but this is a good example. Like, look at how far I am beyond this white line. Like, there's the white line. There's my car. I would say I have 2 tires even barely on the white line, and it's still perfectly fine. I mean, that really ain't the dandiest and the slightest, if I'd say so myself. When they're treating the white lines completely different, especially going on to the last lap of the race, when that was the best race they had the whole time that I had no idea was going to happen, then that's beyond messed up. Again, that'll probably get a clip in and of itself. For those who've stayed this long in the video, that's kind of a hint of what's coming, all that. I could be excited for the future clip and all that. I won't spoil it here, I guess, and that can be its own thing. For those who did watch this, they can get the completely new version of it. For those that did, it can be a different experience and all that, so it's kind of a different way watching that clip and once it's out. If you're still here at this point, that's kind of a bonus, different way in which you can take it when it happens. But, I mean, yeah, folks, when I can use this much track at multiple points of the track, but then exiting the pits when no one's even remotely behind the car either, I was easily clear. And that is a penalty on the very last lap of the race. It was really caught picking close, and the leader was taking the inside line, which, again, to be expected. But, yeah. So, what the game really wants is if 2 cars exit the pit at the same time, they want us both to take the incredibly inside line and basically be on each other's asses. They don't want us to give each other room, essentially. There's not even room to even take, like, half a line of difference. You have to pretty much be on the other person's ass the entire time, or else it's a penalty. It just causes even more wrecks. If they at least gave even half a line of different room, then at least there would be some room for maneuverability and less chance of an accidental nudge or accidental brake check or anything like that. But no, they don't even do that. Again, maybe the white line thing of coming out of the pits is different per track, but I mean, with this track having one of the most relaxed ways of using the white line there is, I mean, look at the white line. It's right there. Look at it. That's maybe like 1.2 width of car. Like 1.2 cars could fit into that, and if you even just barely cross it, you're screwed. Granted, at the low speeds in which you're doing, I mean, if you're purposely making sure to not even have 1 tire on it whatsoever, it's easy enough to do. The speeds are slow enough where that's manageable, even with only maybe 1.2 car of space there, but still. It would have been much better if you could actually use that white line, as in which you can use literally every other white line on the track. How is somebody, especially in the heat of the moment, supposed to know in which how to use that, especially going into the very final lap of the race when you're focused on what the leader's doing, who's directly in front of you, is beyond me. It's not a safety concern in the slightest. He's one, should be ghosted, a car coming out of the pits. As you actually saw in the previous clip, again, there's actually even occasional good things to be mentioned. That is the typical. Occasionally there's good things. The ghosting system actually works. Car coming out of the pits was ghosted. So there's really no need to be worried about the car not out of the pits coming, because it would go through or go around or whatever it may be, because the previous car is ghosted. We saw that already. So this is quite literally useless to have it be used in this way. And again, the clipper come at some point. This is wrong in every way. It's used in a different way for every other bike line on the track. It's pointless in which it is used because there's the ghosting system. And it's kind of a safety hazard too, because it's running two cars right on the exact same line. So there's that much more... Well, I guess probably the better way to word it is there's that much less room for navigation. There's much more likely of there being incidental hits and stuff like that. But yeah, as I said, there's 12 other instances of dirtiness, some longer than others and all that. Some of them I didn't fully trim and all that, but there's at least 12, and that's only of what I witnessed. If I were to go back and comb through different replays, and there were many a race too, in which were quite boring for me, and I ran away and won the race, but if I saw people comment later on of someone racing dirty, or a lot of people had loss in their sportsmanship rating, I saved the replay afterwards anyway, so while I might not have direct footage, I'd have the replay of it. 12 is being extremely conservative. Of 12 other instances of there being dirtiness, that's just 12 that I have on hand right now that I know for absolutely certain was dirty. So yeah, I mean, as I said in the boycott, I'd mention everything that I know for certain is dirty. So yeah, I mentioned those other 12, but if I were to actually go through them in depth like I'm doing here, well, yeah, that, it ain't the dang it. What is that? I'm trying to do math real quick, like, pretty sure that would be a 3-hour video. My math is correct. Or multiple videos to end up equaling 3 hours or whatever it may be. In this one weekend of racing. Granted, I will say that in typical form of ones where I can get a pretty good qualifying time, not to brag or anything because it's rare that happens, but ones that I do happen to get a good qualifying time, generally speaking, whatever the situation may be, track, car, combination, whatever, more often than not, I can just run away with the win, and that was probably how it was. I probably won about 60% of the races, probably, I'll say won about 60% of the races, and then about 55% of the races were, alright, one runaway is about the closest second would be, and then the other time in what's I won, maybe 2 seconds behind, where I had to stay pushing them, but they weren't realistically gonna pass and stuff like that, so. But all the races in which I won were pretty boring, and that is also the typical as well. As has been said about a lot of things, how controversial and all that is what you do see, or imagine what you don't. Imagine what you don't. The vast majority of any circumstance in which I do racing, y'all do not see because it's not really worth knowing. It's boring, or it's repetitive, or whatever it may be, and a lot of this is repetitive as well. As I've already said, I've made references to previous things that happened with the gearing and the brake checking to do all that. And honestly, there's another reference of previous things as well, is how it ends up going with PlayStation Plus. As I've said, there's things that happen, and there's a whole heck of a heap of videos of that if you want to go watch. I mean, to me, it's straightforward. For me specifically, it's not at all worth paying it. I mentioned it a little bit earlier on, but I guess we'll go ahead and get into it. Honestly, as much as maybe I'd make the money back if library didn't get screwed over by the government, so there's yet another reference too. And I might still end up making back in the long run because there's Arweave merger that they're still trying to figure stuff out. Hopefully that one ends up working quite well, and I mean to some speculation and rumors and stuff it will. We'll see on that. But even still, I have the motivation to do this because I have a captive audience and I can make cryptocurrency and maybe like real currency with the RU stuff or the RU currency, or again, however that works in the future from it. The average person might not be that lucky. Honestly, of what a lot of people see of Gran Turismos, those here are even way more popular than me. By default, what most people see is what's more popular. That's just kind of the definition of popularity. A lot of the times, of the most popular people that do these races, other people around them realize that they are popular and don't really want to mess with them. Or they're a heel, because again, it's the real WWE simulator, and they're always going to mess with them. And the game has been out for so long, we know who those heels are. Kimi Velocini and people like that. So it's one of those where either the vast majority ain't going to mess with the really popular person, so more races than not of what you see are calm, so it gives kind of a false narrative of what will be common. Or for those that are going to try and wreck popular people, everyone's aware of it, and it's kind of more of a game than anything. It's an entertainment piece more than it is an actual disturbance or whatever. If anything, it just makes for more good and entertaining clips than it actually truly affects anything in competitive racing. Some of the people who are popular are quite competitive with the racing and stuff. I mean, Disney's had a great popularity boost over last year or so, and he made it to GT Academy and back in the day, and Gran Turismo World Series more recent, probably of someone that's been around the game for as long as he has, to maintain this much skill and pace and all that through the years is amazing, and it's great that he's getting all this popularity. But I mean, even stuff like that happens with the very best like him as well. I mean, there's some people that have channels that are even faster than him too, like Igor Frogger or whoever it may be. But in terms of like popularity to actual driver skill, Disney's with both considered about up there of Max. And again, as I said, there's a whole heck of a heap of people in which deserve to be more popular. I'm pretty sure fairly recently Valerio Gallo did finally pass me in subscribers, which, as I said, that's to be expected and hoped. The reigning, or two-time and only two times has been around, Gran Turismo Olympic champion deserves to be more popular than I am. That wasn't straightforward. I'm not going to make that the slightest. But I mean, still, people like him and many, many others deserve a lot more popularity and all that. And that's, like I said, of the, again, referencing some past stuff, of the real driving simulator being the real WWE simulator now. I don't fault the content creators that do like that, even if it kind of does paint a false narrative to what is the norm. And whether sometimes there's heels that are purposely wrecking them because they realize someone's famous, or people purposely doing all they can to not wreck them, whatever it may be, it doesn't really contribute to the norm. However you look at that, it's still hard to really fault the content creators there, because it really is, don't hate the players as much as you hate the game. Again, some players are meant to be hated as heels, as we're discussing that. I mean, that's part of it too, as we've even discussed fairly recently, but it's still the discussion of the past, even if it's recent past. That's of a lot of things. It's derivative of the norm, as I've discussed before. It's typical. It's typical return to racing. I saw a lot of this coming. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not something as bad as like what made me literally quit playing GT Sport till it almost ended, and the only reason I came back is because GT7 was so awful. I didn't think at an individual instance it would get that bad, but I'm not surprised that there's 12 other instances that are quite bad. And that's like of what I said, of that I still truly really do believe that the World Series events need to be on hiatus after these end. Like this year's, once they end and all that. The final is in, I can't even remember. But once that final ends at the end of the year, it's all going on hiatus so they can make it better. I still truly and really do believe that, probably now even more than when I made that. But the point I was making there it was hard for me to even make that video because it's the same stuff happening that should have been fixed in 2017, and it's still coming to T yet again. Even in that clip, a lot of things I was able to reference in previous videos, but I mean, even of that long video, so not clip, I kind of screwed up saying that, even of that long video, like of what happened in the first clip that I showed, that's where I was going. That long video, the first clip that I showed here, was not something that was going on at the time, even of that video, and that's even yet of a different reference, even of how long of a video that I make saying that it was hard to even make that video because it's just derivative of the norm. Sometimes even other norms come back. As many of that are derivative of the norm, far too many than there ever should be. There's still more than end up coming back, and even in this small sample size of racing, for one weekend, I did 15 maybe. I didn't count the specifics, but I'll say around 15 races. And it was boring for the most part, or it was dirty for the others. That's the typical. It's boring for the most part. And again, you can take my driving as you may. I'm doing it all on the alt account as well. Frankly, what I should have ended up doing is do more like challenges and stuff, like last of whatever in a Mopar. But I had already previously qualified, so that didn't work. And the Viper just doesn't have enough balance of performance to drive realistically for winning a Mopar. Maybe if I would have done it in the middle of the night and I take my rating for a while, I could have tried for that. But the amount of time that would have actually take my rating, it probably would have not even had much time to do actual racing to try for that. Anyway, and I could have done like a first to last to first where I already did some qualifying, but everybody knows how to exploit the penalty system at this point, to where in any given race there's so much dirty driving. Again, you can take my driving as you may on the alt account, racing around about B level of driver rating drivers. Take that as you may. Of how many drivers, even at that level and lower and higher in all the levels in the game, as I talked about before, yet another derivative of the norm and typical, that they know how to get away with being dirty and not getting penalties. So there's no way I was going to be able to do first to last to first, realistically. Probably what would have happened is first to last, and then those who are farther to the back, realistically, are going to be more dirty. Would have been first to last to like 9th, on average, probably, if I were to have done that. And it would have just made me even more angry and not focused and wanting more revenge on others and stuff like that. Anyway, so it would have been a first to last to revenge challenge, pretty much, is what that would have turned into. So I didn't even really bother with challenge. A little bit of an idea that I had was a pit early challenge, get on pole and then pit at the end of lap 1. It's kind of derivative of the norm. It would have been pretty close to how it would have went on the last to first. That would have just been so much of the story anyway. I know I wouldn't have been able to win that. Plus, that one probably would have ended up turning out fairly boring anyway, because at least for the last to first, there's strategy in which to pit. If I pit at the same time every time, there's less strategy there. So yeah, I in the 15-ish races that I did, I didn't really do any challenges or anything like that. Maybe in hindsight, I should have tried something to try and break it up, but I mean, given of how boring it was of the general sense, even at the best of how the challenges would have went, it probably would have went really about average in terms of excitement and stuff, and probably wouldn't have even been worth making a video of anyway. So at least to be running of the norm, I could get the driver rating up a little bit and stuff like that. Throughout of the 15 races, even with all the dirtiness and all that, my average finish was probably maybe 1.8 or so. The lowest finish was 4th once, 3rd a few times, 2nd a few more, and then I won about 60% of the time. I'd say my average was about 1.8. My driver rating went up from low B, probably maybe 10% of B, to maybe 45% of B in about 15 races. Take that as you may. I try my best to race of different times of the day and stuff like that to make it more of a varied field and all that, but again, that one truly is take as you may. I mean, as I've said, always forever, or not really always and forever, but for a long time now, I don't really care about driver and sportsmanship rating, especially on all account. Especially again, because I won't be racing to the next free weekend, which I have no idea how that is, or how long that'll be, that sort of thing. I don't know. But, I mean, yeah, it's typical. It's a derivative of the norm. If I were to have had a PlayStation Plus throughout all this time, there wouldn't have been much more of actual online racing videos. There really wouldn't have. I'm sure there probably would have been some by default with having different car and track combinations, although so many of them are repeated so much, it's hard to really say truly different. The majority of them are the same. Now they have something enough for a video to happen, law of averages and such. I mean, overall, this is still meant to be my career, so I would have done them to the peak of my ability. As always, take that as you may. And a lot of times it's kind of entertainment as well. But also, to end off this video, I'll kind of do it on two things. Of one, I don't know when the next time I'll be playing online is. It truly is to the PlayStation online weekend when that is free, or maybe because my first Gran Turismo is a free game, it might have online. And there's something with that, but all things considered, again, maybe there'll be some car track combinations or even get lucky with something like this. Again, law of averages and all that. Some things happen good. I mean, the GT Sport was a good example of that. The very last race that I did went pretty cotton picking good, to say the least. That was the best way I ever would have figured to end off that game. Much, much better than I figured even in like 2017 or 18 would have been ending off that game. A lot of averages and such, but overall, I had more, and I think I hinted at it earlier, so I mean, that's to the typical derivative of the norm too, because I hinted at it. I had more fun doing this than anything else. But specifically, I saw what this is now. I mean, you could tell the general trend, it's qualifying. But I'll start at the start and end at the end sort of thing. With this, the first time that I set in pretty much an hour of gameplay. There we go. It's back to the beginning now. Is a 47.071. My best at the time was the 46.990, which is still video on the channel. This is fast forwarded to its full extent. You could probably, again, use context and typical and all that sort of stuff, derivative of the norm, tell what's happening. In this basically an hour of footage, I did not improve that time. That ended up 2 tenths faster later on. And even still, there it is. Okay, that's to the end now. That's what time I ended on. The first lap, I did a 47.071. The last lap, my best was 47.025. And I didn't improve on the 46.990. And that's in an hour straight of doing stuff. I'll still show some actual driving on the screen to end off, but you get what's going on. Yeah. In that hour, and it's only the hour or so, there was a whole heck of people more practice there too. Of not improving, technically whatsoever, was more fun than, even at its average, of the best that I got of racing. And this is with a car that I fairly enjoy driving. I'd rather be driving a Viper that's balanced to performance and all that. But I mean, this car is decent enough once I figured out the two. But that's part of why I enjoyed this more too. It's because although I didn't improve, I got rid of possible negatives. I tested out enough to where I got rid of things I knew most certainly didn't work. So I got rid of the possible, well, some of the possible negatives, so then that way, once I continued, there would be less that I would have to deal with of negatives later on. So even of not improving, it was still fun knowing of what negatives not to do, and just having that information and positivity And that I know that I won't have to deal with those negatives anymore. That in and of itself is positive, knowing that I don't have to deal with the negative. But going into each individual race, I don't know how it's going to go, and it's safe to assume that I would have to deal with negatives on a race-by-race basis. At average, again, I won about 60% of the races. On average, the general negative is just boring and predictive, and a lot of times derivative of the norm. Of the other, it's dirty and a lot of times malicious, and still predictive of the norm and typical and all that. Obviously, this is typical. This is overall probably what I put more miles in GT7 than anything as qualifying, especially since February by default. I'd say even more than anything is qualifying. But at least with this, and especially when there's tuning, well, technically, just kind of by definition, qualifying, doing lap after lap, it's the same. Sometimes they say if you're doing the same thing over and over, it's a definition of insanity, but ultimately, take my driving as you may, it's not exactly the same thing over and over. Even if I might intend it to be, it doesn't exactly turn out to be, I'll put it like that. So it's not exactly definition of insanity with my style of driving. My style of driving is not exactly the most insane, so yeah. The point being is that this is more fun than the racing, and granted, this in and of itself is an outlier too, because it's a tuning event. So of course, I could take a lot of negatives away from this that I wouldn't have to deal with later that aren't going to be typical of an event without tuning. But even still, in a lot of events without tuning, I'd still do over 1,000 miles. Usually it's Tokyo Expressway, Central Loop, or karts. But even occasionally on this track, there'd be some without tuning that aren't with karts at this track that I'd still do a whole heck of a mile. Again, all in all, it's most typical and derivative of the norm, and I just simply don't do the events. On average, week by week, if I even do the events, it's going to be one of the week, so that's even 1/3 right there. And more weeks than not, I don't even really do it because there's no competitive or entertainment value. Or, I guess you could say, entertainment value to it. That, all in all, is the most typical and derivative, but that's probably of any and every one for the most part, unless you are one of the ones that are the most popular, which is not, as I said, that's not really as typical and derivative and all that. That doesn't show the average experience of the Gran Turismo player, what the most popular and by default, what most people see, because that's the definition of popularity, see. And I don't blame them in the slightest, as I said. But even all of this, you could say, is derivative of the norm. A lot of this kind of traces back to things that I already said or shown or whatever it may be. But still, when I'm having more fun doing the qualifying than the racing, it's not a good look. Especially doing an hour straight of qualifying that gets me technically nowhere. That's not really the Danish, folks. That really ain't. All things considered, to me, Gran Turismo 7 is the worst game in the franchise. I understand how people are getting enjoyment out of it, just like I understand how people get enjoyment out of fake wrestling. But it just ain't for me. GT7 ain't for me, fake wrestling ain't for me, but I understand enjoyment from it. It's the manufactured drama, it's the excitement, it's the doing the parody of the norm, and what is considered real, actual simulation esports and all that. Again, in a sea of mediocrity to downright terrible, there is the occasional good thing, and that is also typical. Typically, I can look at the best of the bad situation, and it's not all awful. There are individual things to say. The ghosting system worked. Qualifying worked. It was nice to see, although this race is, again, derivative of the norm, it's a repeat. There is a different way to set up the car than when it was before, because this happened on a new physics system. So there was a slightly different way once I tuned the car to get the most out of me. And the fastest lap ended up being a 46.4, so probably tuned in a different way as well. So, again, out of the sea of mediocrity to downright negativity, there is the occasional positive, and that is in of itself still typical. But overall, to me, Gran Turismo 7 is still the worst game in the franchise, and it's, in a lot of ways, this went typical of how I figured. Of an individual, I didn't really see it being as bad as what made me literally quit playing GT Sport to happen. But in some ways, I kind of figured of the previous video that I made of saying of how it's derivative of the norm and they need to quit with that and they need to have the World Series events on hiatus, mentioning of how many would go derivative of the norm, of how many I even got of that circumstance. My law of averages kind of again, I have mentioned before, in some way I shouldn't have been all that surprised that a different derivative of the norm happened. I just wasn't expecting that individual one, and of it's what I showed at the beginning of the video. So overall, this really and truly is my typical return to Gran Turismo 7 online. But as I said, online, not particularly racing. There will probably be the clip of, as I said, with the white line thing. So you, as of hearing about that, you can kind of take that of a different notion for those that weren't watching the video at the point. But there's also going to be something different and fun as well, that it's typical of what I can get at online. And to see mediocrity to downright terribleness, there's a positive as well, a video that's coming that I hope you all enjoy that one too. Again, I got some positive that was typical out of GT7 Online, and I kind of figured I would get something of that out of it that I'm not going to spoil. But it is something in a way that is derivative of the norm and typical that y'all have seen before, but it happened in a different and honestly better way than it did before. And that's coming as well. So that individual instance, when that comes, will be worth the yeehaw. But on typical, for me at least, it's typical GT7 Online is the worst in the franchise, and even the game as a whole. It's typical. That's what I expected. There's some individual things I didn't. But on average of what I expected is what happened, and that most certainly ain't worth the yeehaw.